Chapter 6 Brown Spring. The old man wrote, "The time of the Berlin Wall was a time of confusion. It made a lasting scar upon both Germanies, who were encaged in its concrete enshrine for posterity to gaze upon in awe." He paused and wiped the sweat from his forehead. The summers had been hot since before the summer of storms, and dry, but he guessed that his level of toleration had also dropped as he got older. The tiny droplets were trapped by his wrinkles. It pained the old man to write, and with age had come absent-mindedness. At times the pain in his chest was great, but he continued. His task was not complete. And at times his mind would drift into the past. At these times the bitterness would return. He did not believe in God. If there was a God, he was a bitter God. The old man laughed at the thought and said out loud, "That we share in common." At other times his thoughts were compassionate and forgiving. At these times the bitterness would disappear. He would remember happy times. Kind faces would appear, soothing him, and then nothing. Often the bitterness and compassion would be entwined in a strange mixture, and now he was thinking about the man he had seen sleeping at the base of the lighthouse, and wondered where he was going. It was rare for him to see anybody passing his way. He had strange feelings, and he had spited the man for shooting the rat. The rat jerky that he made was the old man's mainstay diet now, along with the little seaweed. But mostly the seaweed just made him sick. It was still polluted with the decaying bodies of the dead and the heavy metals, even though the fish had eaten their share in the beginning, and the floods had doused the rivers with a 500-year supply of chemical pollution. The lighthouse had been his home now since before the summer of storms. His daughters lay buried in the back. His second wife had died years before in an airline crash, way before the summer of storms. It seemed that such crashes had become more common before the beginning of the end. Thinking about these things, the old man fell asleep. In his dream, he was back at war. A face flashed in front of him. Only for a moment, and then it was gone. A tranquil feeling encompassed him. A bright light blinded him. He awoke, and the tranquility vanished. Looking up, he realized he was back in the war. Not Vietnam, not World War II, but he was back in the war to end all wars. And strangely, his memories of all that happened afterwards were intact. He looked at his hands, and they were no longer wrinkled. He was a young man again. He thrilled at the thought, but only for a second. He saw himself half standing and half sitting in the trench, waiting for the next round to come in. That was a close one, he thought. The warm mud was dripping in his eyes, and with the back of his hand he cleared them for the 10th time. The weapon in his hands felt like a hot poker, an extra hand that somehow did not fit. Then it was burning. The heat was intense, and his hands did not seem like they belonged to him. In the lull, he was acutely aware of the sounds around him. The man on his left was screaming. A line of tanks were moving up from behind, and to his right, in the distance, he thought he could hear a church bell ringing. He looked at his pocket watch. It had stopped at 3 o'clock. He didn't know if it was a.m. or p.m. Then he was sick. He vomited until he was dry heaving. Sounds became distant. The darkness crept upon him. In his last thought, before surrendering to the darkness, he saw a dark man wearing a cowboy hat. When he awoke again, the first thing he heard was a shout going through the trenches. Then immediately there was a movement of bodies over the side, but they were far to the left. To the right, everyone around him was either dead or dying. The noise was deafening. He put his hands on his ears, pressing them hard, trying not to hear and to forget. "We've knocked out their main gun," he heard someone shout. "Those bastards, we did it for good this time. We're moving in the morning for sure now," he heard another voice say. Then his ears were fine-tuned again, and he heard the moaning and the screaming of the injured and dying around him. But the dying were mostly quiet. They knew they were dying and wouldn't be going home. They had already accepted their fate and were at peace. The face of the dark man in the cowboy hat appeared again, and he shuddered, pushing the thought deep inside of his brain. He guessed he should be dead, but he wasn't for some strange reason. He had just become the only survivor of a direct hit. He felt lucky. Looking at his hands and his body, and feeling his face and head, he realized that other than some scratches, he was not even injured. He felt exhilarated and alive. It was a feeling that was only felt in the face of danger. The next thing he was aware of was someone putting a cup to his lips. The liquid was warm going down, then hot in his stomach. The man with the cup spoke. "I can't imagine how you survived here. This spot was hit hard. Sleep a while. There won't be much happening tonight." "Thanks," he told the man, and drifted back into a fitful sleep. He dreamed within the dream. A bright orb blinded him. He looked down, and his arm was gone. His guts lay spilled around him. There was no blood, no pain. Then he noticed his arm lying in the mud. He looked to his left and to his right, and saw the torn and mangled bodies around him. The nearest one was face down in the water. Turning the man over, he saw that the face looked familiar. Faces flashed in front of him, and they were laughing. Then they were gone. He opened his eyes, and it was light. There were still bodies around him, but the one that looked like him was gone. He looked at his watch. It could have no meaning. It was still stuck at 3 o'clock. Closing his eyes, he went back to sleep. But before he drifted off, his thoughts were back to the more recent past, the lighthouse, and the canister of evil soup he had released in the swamp. His dreams were more peaceful now, and he knew he had been punished and then comforted.